Hello everybody and welcome to another Houdini tutorial. My name is Kate and today we'll be doing another episode in the Stargate Atlantis series. Today we're going to try and build a hyperdrive portal that you often see in the show when a ship is gonna jump to light speed. Let's get started. This tutorial will be slightly easier than the previous ones. This deals a lot more with pyrotechnics and also just basic sims and blend shapes, so feel free to follow along. So for this current scene, my camera is currently transformed to these values: focal length, aperture, all that. Those are the values right there. For this particular setup, I am using a point light. Its color is blue, intensity 5, exposure 4.08. and it's transformed to these values. The next one is a point light 2. Rename them as you see fit. It's also carrying a sort of bluish color, but it's a disc type, and its intensity is also cranked up along with the exposure. The transforms are this, and now I'll cover this one a little bit later because it involves the build portal itself. I have two little rendered geometries. Turning them off, you can see the different parts. One has these arms that come out, and the other is just the plain portal setup. The render portal has a billowy smoke shader, so we're going to jump to it. And as you can see, I've shifted the colors, so it's a lot cooler than a regular fireball. The emission is cranked up to 2.02, and those colors are changed as I saw fit. So jumping up, these are the values. And then jumping over to the density tab, these are the settings there. Everything else is pretty much the same and is on default. So jumping out again, we've got our render arms, which is a different shader. And then jumping over here, we can kind of see that they carry the same colors, but the emissions are slightly different. So I'll walk through those values with you. And then jumping over to density, we have these settings here. Over here, if we're jumping out, we have our render arm geo over here for our geometry light. The material is a glow shader, so jumping over here, and glow arms light. So here the geometry lights only work if the geometry you're pulling from, so our separate little geometry node from everything else, has a shader on it. So make sure you create a shader for your geometry lights. And I'll show you how I preferably set up geometry lights to get them to work in my scene. So diving inside, after I turn these both off, we have our build portal set up. So looking over here, you can see this gray box. This is my emitter. And my emitter is set up a little bit differently than a traditional like sphere or circle square, and I'll get there in a second. So starting with a torus, you can see that I have cranked it into the air. This right here is just a geometry light. I'm going to turn it off. There we go. So here are the settings for it. You can see I added a mountain to the torus. So here are the settings for it. Over here I have a sphere, and you can see it's very, very, very tiny, and I'll get back to that later. Over here I also have another copy and pasted this tiny sphere and then plugged it into a switch. And then over here I have another sphere, but it's a little bit larger and it's got a bigger scale. They then laid down a null for it called sphere. This is optional. I just wanted to make sure that some objects were kind of highlighted so I could pick up on them more easily. So that's why the nulls are there. Over here I've added a blend shape. And what this blend shape is doing, it's switching between this torus shape down to our sphere. And you can see that it's animated over time. And these are the values for the keyframes. And then I've added a blend shape null. Now, here's where it can get a little bit tricky. Over here, I have two very tiny spheres. And my idea was that I wanted this portal shape to start small, get bigger, and then go small again. So I needed to create a starting and end geometry, which was, in this case, a sphere that was very, very tiny. The way I plugged them in is that this one in the first input, this middle object over here, so the largest size the portal will get to, was plugged into the second input. This middle shape, where the torus kind of blends, is plugged into the third input. This sphere that's getting smaller now is plugged into the fourth, and the tiniest sphere is once again plugged into the end. So the idea being that these shapes will kind of switch over time and also create a very good kind of arc. So over in the switch, you can see that I've had this little kind of script. So basically what this is doing is switching between the shapes over time, just like I talked about. And if we go through the timeline, you can see that sphere starts small, pops into this big torus, torus kind of closes, and then switches. You can also see that I've multiplied this value over time, and it's got a speed of 0.5. The higher the number, the faster the switch is going to go, and the same with, you know, reducing the number as well. So that's kind of up to your preference of how fast you would like these shapes to switch. Over here, I've added a scatter. So on these shapes, I want X amount of points generated. So there's about 3,000 points, and this is what I've done. Then I've added an out points null and a point generate over here. And what this point generate is doing, you can't really see it without any visualization tools. It's generating this one singular point in the scene. And in this particular case, that's the starting point for our PopNet. So diving inside, you can see something already starting to happen. So we've got our first source input, and you can see that its impulse activation is the first frame. At frame 1, it will be on 1, and after that, it will be 0. Over here, the life expectancy is also kind of animated. At frame 150, the life expectancy is at 100, and over here, the life expectancy goes down to 0. I've also, as a source input, I've selected all points and used first context geometry. And then now, if we look at the next node, I've used a pop attract, and what this pop attract is doing is attracting the points to these shapes that we chose to blend in and out of. So we'll skim through the whole timeline so you can see. So it goes up and switches between that. So you can kind of see their shapes morphing and how the point is blending between them. So you can also see the context that I'm using is the use second context geometry, which is our little portal shapes. Then I've added a pop drag, air resistance of 3. Then on my pop solver, it's pretty much the same. And the pop object is normal as well. Then what I've done next is something a little bit sneaky. The way I did this setup, if you've ever seen any of my previous tutorials, you know that I'm a bit lazy when it comes to Pyro, and I like using my legacy tools. In this particular case, the way I created the next 5 nodes in the sequence was actually through a little bit of a trickery, and I'll show you exactly what I did. I added a null, I dropped down a DOP network, went inside it, jumped to the surface, went to my Pyros tab, and clicked Billowy Smoke. So you'll see something start to happen, and you'll be dragged into the build portal .net. So you can see we were inside here. These beautiful little nodes were generated, and dragging them up here all I did was pull these nodes and add them like that. So suddenly I have a null, and I can delete this null and keep my out density, which is going into my DOPNet. I then went to the surface, grabbed these import Pyro fields, copied them, dived inside here, and pasted them into here. So now we have 2 of the nodes that we need for the simulation. So now that you know how I did that, that's kind of how I did that setup. Feel free to do it on your own. I'm going to delete these nodes and explain to you the settings on this side. So going down, we've got our create density, which has a particle separation of 0.299. Going down, these are the scales for the density and temperature. Going to add node, we have attributes density and temperature. That's pretty much it. Rasterize, voxel sizes is linked to the voxel size of our Pyro in our DOPNet, and I'll show that to you in a second. Particle scale is turned down, and the shutter for velocity blur is cranked up to 5. So make sure you have that on. Now over here I decided that looking at a rasterize, you can see this little box on the ground, you can see this shooting up into a big giant sphere. So I didn't want to I didn't want to generate smoke while this little particle is rising. So I added a switch so I could switch to nothing before a certain frame. And also if you look down at the ends here, you'll see that our little kind of glowy ball doesn't disappear either. So I'll show you the little scripts that I added to my switches to switch between frames. So you can kind of see it's changing here and it doesn't go away. So going to the switch, I've added a null, and I've made sure before a certain frame this stays on. So the first input stays on, meaning it's our lovely particles. And then down here, anything before frame 40, cut it, get rid of it. So same method. So at our out density, that is going to our DOPNet over here. And diving inside, we'll let Houdini slightly cook itself out. So diving inside our DOPNet, you can see now that we've edited our emitter enough, our Pyro network starts off exactly where we want it to be. In this situation, I might actually see where I can start the simulation, because in this case, I have it starting at frame 1. I think I would like for it to start on frame 40, which is probably going to save us a lot of sim time because we don't want to backlog everything. So diving inside, you can see it start to cook out, and it's grabbing our little dusty ball. And so now I'm going to put this on manual and skim through all the settings. So I don't really need this merge. And on my source density from Pyro, these are the settings. You can see I've animated the activation. So you can see it starts at on frame 168, it's on, and then after that it turns off. We don't need the we need the simulation or the portal to disappear at this point. And then I haven't really touched any of the density attributes or temperature besides the velocity, and that is once again animated to turn off after frame 169. So that's pretty much it. Going to the gas local sharpen, what I've done is just added a random one down. I haven't really changed any of the settings. I've added a gas shred into our third input. You can see here, again, it's just a regular one. Visualization, everything like that is turned off. And over here we've got our default resize container. Turned off max bounds. And I've made sure the upper and lower padding is adjusted to contain our moving objects. Because sometimes you might encounter that if your geometry changes changes over time or changes its shape or size, your padding scale or bounding box is going to cut it off. So just be aware of that. Going to our Pyro, we've got a division size of 0.09, and we've adjusted the bounding box accordingly. Going to the PyroNet, we can see that I've animated the dissipation over time and adjust the block size. So looking at the dissipation, starting on frame 96, I want a very low dissipation. And then at frame 168, I wanted to raise it just a little bit. Probably don't need that key, I just realized that. Keyframe, keyframe. Going to frame 202, I've added a dissipation of 7. So after that, our dissipation just ramps up into full gear. Disturbance is a 2, shredding is a 2. Dissipation, haven't really touched that. Going over to combustion, everything's the same here. And then, once again, I've done a little bit of animation on this simulation tab. So at frame 96, I've added a buoyancy of 3. At 168, I've added a buoyancy lift of 6. And over time, you can see them drop. So the buoyancy lift gets really big and then it goes down. Then added a drag just to adjust the forces, and that's pretty much it in that DOPNet. I then used import Pyro fields, which is importing Pyro from this DOPNet instead of the Pyro visualization tool, because this one contains all our values and we might need those later on. I then cached it out. So going back to auto update, we're just going to let Houdini think itself out. And you can see our portal starting to implode around 174. So going down here, I had to transform and tweak where everything was, because it didn't really work with my camera angle. So I just wanted to adjust it just a little bit. So I shrunk this down to make it more manageable to a uniform scale of 0.12, and then added another transform down here, which is tilting it towards the camera, and you can see from our camera it's now suddenly in frame. And then I've added a nice little null that I've called out portal over here. Something to quickly note is that these 4 transforms are exactly the same. So the transform over here is a little bit different, but the one over here, and okay, cut that out. So yeah. And then I've added an out portal down here. As you can see, I've also added a merge, so I can actually see both of my creations together. In this case, this is what it looks like on that frame. So jumping up, we're going to move on to the arms that you can kind of see in the simulation here. So jumping away from our Pyro, I'm going to turn off my materials and my lighting at this point, because I don't really need them in the simulation. So you can see I've added a circle that I've transformed to these values and put it on 0, 0 of my scene. I gave it some UVs, and then I added a sphere that I didn't really change, that I switched over from polygon. Then I added some UVs. And then I merged them together so they kind of look like an alien spacecraft. Then I added one of my kind of favorite tools at the moment, draw a curve, and I drew a bunch of almost kind of tentacles coming off the sphere. So one way you can use draw a curve is hitting enter on your keyboard. A little red thing should appear and you can draw your curve wherever you like. The one thing that you need to change in your draw a curve SOP is that you need to update what you want for it to project geometry on. What you need to do is switch this over to send rays and do a projection onto geometry. And everything else should probably stay the same and you're good to go. Then converted these lines to polygons, and then I smoothed them out. So you've got these kind of interesting hair effects going. I've then transformed these lines and made sure they was poking up like that, like a butterfly. And I added a carve. And this is where I animated this. So the arms kind of come out of the portal halfway through, and then they go back down. So on the first frame, both UVs are at 0. Jumping over to frame 72, both of them are at 0. 120, 144, and that's pretty much it. Then I added a resample, so you can kind of see how the lines have been resampled over time, and a polywire. And this polywire was a little bit heavy, so be patient, but you can kind of see that our beautiful geometry is starting to grow kind of like a flower. And then add a trail, and what this trail is doing is adding our velocities onto our object. So we're using our forward difference and computing the velocity, and that's pretty much it. And we've lowered the velocity scale to a 0.2. I've then added an out arms geo null down here, so you can kind of see what happens. And you can see over here I've transformed this so it's tilting on its side, and I've also moved them like this. And then I've added another render arms geo, so this can go over to our geometry light. Now I'm going to go back up here. So I went over here and I created a separate geometry called render arm geo, and diving inside, it's just an object merge that's picking up on our render arm geo null. And then click this, jump to lights, and clicked geometry light. And then I got a geometry light in my scene. And that's pretty much it. So going back over to our next simulation, I then did the same method I did earlier to create this DOPNet with this DOPNet. And you might be a little bit confused of why they're called DOPNet 3 and DOPNet 2. I had to experiment while creating this file, so there were a lot of DOPNets involved. I won't go through that step again, but that's how I created the DOPNet for these arms. I then went to create density 2, and these are the settings that I put everything on. Add noise, everything's pretty much the same. Rasterize, I played with the voxel size and the particle scale here. Then I had my out density null, and we'll quickly color that black. And now we can dive inside our DOPNet. Going inside here, we can see that this is the same. And now I'm just going to click L on my keyboard and lay that all out. So, going to our source density from sphere, we've cranked up our density as just a little bit, as you can see here. And the velocity and the temperature are the same. You can see once again I've activated the activation. And at frame 150, it's at a 1. And over here at 192, it's 0. So it gradually kind of shuts itself off. For the gas shred, once again, it's a regular gas shred node. Nothing to really talk about over here. Then I've added a gas diffuse, and this I've turned down the diffusion rate and left pretty much everything the same. Then we have our default resize container. I've turned off the max bounds, so everything is fine. And I didn't have to adjust the lower padding scale or the upper padding scale. On the Pyro, the division size is 0.012, and I just adjusted the size of the bounding box here. Then I went to the Pyro solver, and you can see once again I've animated the dissipation. So at frame 50, it's a 0.5, and at the end, it's a 7. The disturbance is a 1, and everything else is turned off. The block size is lowered just a little bit. Going to combustion, everything is fine. And on the simulation, these are the settings. It's pretty simple. And I'll delete my merge node. So jumping to the surface, we are once again using the import Pyro. We are using the import Pyro visualization because in the process over here we didn't really need too many values. And then I've cached everything out. So jumping back to our camera, we can skim through our timeline. We can kind of see our portal starting to blossom. And one challenge is that it's actually pointing in the wrong direction. So we need to transform it to match our portal over here on our right side. So we need to point it towards the camera and transform it down. So now it's completely lined up with the main portal itself. I'm looking through our merge node. We should see it. There we go. That's pretty much it for building a portal in Houdini. But before you go, I'm also going to walk you through the comp setup that I did for this, because half of producing the effect was also in comp. So let's jump over to Nuke and I'll show you what to do. So as you can see, I have a portal that I rendered in Nuke, and you can kind of see it's dark and it's mystical and it's got some weird kind of lens flare going on. And I've kind of superimposed the Orion right there. So it's kind of weird, but we can do it. So I did 2 separate renders of my little portal. So we have our main portal over here. You can kind of see glow and kind of shrink. So you can see our portal is moving really well and it's disappearing really well. And based on your preference or speed, you can choose whether or not you want to speed it up. Turning this to 1, so we only see one panel. And over here we have our little arms kind of sprouting out. You may go, oh, that's really messy. Like, the arms are sprouting everywhere, they're exploding. Well, we're kind of good in the department of that we only need the arms there for a certain amount of time when we just kind of need it to highlight stuff. We just need some extra motion in the Hyperdrive portal itself. So now it's roto time. First thing that I did with the main portal, and we're going to start on him, is I added a glow. And basically what this glow is going to do is just make him a little bit brighter in a certain area. So in the middle of the portal, I've just made a rotosphere alpha. And then I've also added a grade, and I've kind of graded it to a blue color. And once again, chosen the same roto, copy paste up here onto here. And I've just inverted it. So it's highlighting the out, not the in. I've added another grade node just to make things a little bit darker and moody. And rotoed that again. So just made a bigger kind of circle roto where I wanted it to go. And for the ellipse, those are the settings. I added some volume rays because I wanted even more glow in the center. So you can see those settings there. Graded it down because I didn't want any highlights to clip at this particular moment. Because you can kind of see it start to do it there. And then I merged in something kind of sneaky. So you can see already that it's kind of like the invert of our current little portal. Well, what those are highlights. And over here I've used a luminance channel. So what this is doing is grabbing from the RGB input and outputting an RGB alpha. And if we go to the alpha channel, that's kind of what it looks like. And when it goes from that to an inner shape. I've then shuffled the alpha to the actual color on the RGBA, graded it just a little bit. Oh, I better jump up. So I've graded it just a little bit, made it some blue color. Graded it down so it's darker. Again, a roto. Hue shifted it to a green and animated the brightness of that green over time. So it would get gradually greener or gradually brighter in certain areas, and that's what I wanted. Graded that down just a little bit more and blurred it, because why not? Then jump over to my merge, and you can kind of see something funky going on, where over time I've also animated the mix, so it's blending these values on the left with the ones on the right. Then jumping down here is where I merged over my arms. So you kind of see that it's very different from what you saw in the render, but it looks really damn cool. So going over here, we have our render. And you can see some very kind of wispy arms and detail being lost, but in this case, creatively, this is what I wanted. So the first thing over here I added was a glow. Once again, highlighting the inner circle of where I wanted the brightest places to be. I've added a grade, so turned it a nice kind of blue color. Added another roto, and also inverted it, so the outside is blue. Then added another roto, which is making the edges of our little tentacles darker, and inverted that roto as well, which is great. Added some volume range, so we got a really, really bright center. Graded it down to make it kind of mysterious, and then merged it over with the same kind of alpha pass thing that we did earlier. So jumping over to the luminance key, going to the alpha channel, you can see that I've compressed it, so we've got some highlights building up. Going to shuffle, I've added the going from alpha to our color channels, and then graded this up just a little bit and turned it blue, and then blurred it just a little bit. So it's now crossing over here, and we've got some arms. So if you turn this off, you can kind of see where they are. So I've added another grade node. What this is doing is just making things darker. We've chosen the areas where we want to make it super dark. Then I merged some sparkles over, and what these sparkles are is just randomized lines. And I've also animated the merge on this one, so I can blend them in and out when I see fit, so that you can see them right there. Sparkles are just these tiny little lines, and I've also animated their values over time as well, so the size of these sparkles will change. I've then blurred it and merged it over. I've then color corrected this, so we've got some saturation, lowered saturation going, as well as our highlights are being lowered, and then we're merging this over here. So you can see the portals start to form and grow and kind of change over time. And then add an edge blur, because I wanted to blur the edges of the portal, make it kind of mysterious. You can do this, or you can retain the detail, it's really up to you. And inverted that roto as well. And then sharpened everything. Down here you can see that I've just comped a little ship, and everything below this point in the setup is just things I was using to make my thumbnails, so I won't get into it too much. I'll just kind of skip over it, but that's pretty much how you can make a portal like this. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. My name is Kate, and I'll see you in the next one.